everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. And y'all don't even know how many times I've tried to film this video. Hopefully this one is gonna be the winning one. Today I'm here to talk to you about my favorite books of all time. It happens to land on an even number, so that's great, but I didn't really intend for that to be the case. I just kind of set out to document my favorite books of all time so that I can kind of keep track of how this list changes over time. So this is my way, or my starting point for this, and I'm thinking maybe in a year I can come back, revisit it, and see how the list has changed. So these are pretty much in kind of the order in which I favorite them. So let's get started right away with the Autobiography of Malcolm X. This is a book, it's one of those few books that I think really transformed my life. Like, reading this really did change me. It opened up the topic of social justice for me because Malcolm X is really incisive in his critique of the US, of racism, and especially what I think he's really good at is pinpointing the problems in white liberal thinking, right? White liberal activism. He is brilliant at that. In college, I took a course that was called Religious Ethics of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. A lot of times these two men are pitted as like opposite ends of the civil rights movement. They really were not, especially towards the end of their lives. They had a lot more in common than not, but religion did play an important part in both their lives. Their fathers were both Baptist ministers, and obviously the Baptist Church was an important part of Martin Luther King's activism. The organization of the civil rights movement was largely done through churches, to black churches. And for Malcolm X, it was the Nation of Islam, which he kind of ends up separating himself from later in his life, but that did play an important role. I know he is largely, when he is remembered, he's remembered for the line "by any means necessary," right? Which people tend to criticize because it means violence. But he really wasn't an advocate of just violence for violence sake. He was an advocate of, like, when violence is used against you, that you have a right to defend yourself, is what he preached. And he himself was not a violent individual. He never really takes part in that, although his life ended violently. He, like Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. But again, what this book did is, I read it in high school, and what it did for me was really open up that world. Now, I've read it a couple of times since then. I don't know if it would have the same kind of power now, especially if you have read a lot on social justice issues. It might not have that same kind of impact that it did when I read it, but I think it's still a book that's really worthwhile reading. Again, because it does offer a really incisive critique of American society. My college professor, I think, put it very beautifully. She said that if the U.S. were on trial, Martin Luther King Jr. would be a witness for the defense, and Malcolm X would be a witness for the prosecution, and that both of what they have to say about this country is incredibly powerful and important. And I think Malcolm X is really underread in the U.S. All right, the second book on my list is not the first Jane Austen I read, but the one that my favorite one, basically, and that is Persuasion. And the reason why I favorite this one over Pride and Prejudice is because I find Persuasion to be a much more mature story. This is one of the last ones that Jane Austen wrote, and it deals with more mature characters. Both Anne and Captain Wentworth are kind of not at their prime. They're still pretty young, but they're not at the prime in their kind of romantic lives. He's kind of, they've had their first chance at love. The two of them fell in love when they were young. He proposed to her, she accepted, and then she is persuaded to end the engagement and not marry him. And the book is set later on in their lives when they are at different points in different social kind of economic situations, and power dynamics have shifted a little bit, but you know, they're still in love. And I just found the themes in here to be much more mature, the characters to be much more mature, and so I connected to it a lot more than I did to some of her other books. All right, book number 3 on the list is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So this is one of those books that I never reread. I read it once, and it had such a powerful impact that I've been a little afraid of rereading it. So I first read this in high school. It was for an AP psychology assignment, and I just remember how immersive this book was for me. Like, every time I was reading it, I felt totally immersed in the main character's life, and it is pretty autobiographical. So some of the experiences of the main character were very much the experience of Sylvia Plath, and what she describes is really how violent the mental health industry was. Like, her descriptions of electroshock treatment, which is still used today, are really powerful. Like, that is not a good experience. And like, as I was reading this book, I was questioning my own mental health and thinking about mental health issues. And so this book's on my list because of how powerful the reading experience was at the time. And so I've never reread it because I don't know that it would have that same kind of power on a reread. But at some point I would like to reread it and kind of see if it holds up for me in the same way that it did when I first read it. The next book on the list is a Holocaust memoir, and that is Still Alive, A Holocaust Girlhood Remembered by Ruth Kluger. I've had the opportunity to meet Ruth Kluger, and I always say to everyone that if you ever have an opportunity to meet a Holocaust survivors, to please take it. As survivors get older, many of them are passing away, and these opportunities have become much more rare. So I read this book in graduate school, and it's just such an incredibly powerful book. I think it is the best Holocaust memoir I have ever read, and it does not follow the typical pattern of a Holocaust memoir. I think there is very much a structure that we expect out of Holocaust memoirs, in that I think what we're expecting is kind of the Night by Elie Wiesel's kind of structure. I think that one's a perfect example of what we expect out of Holocaust memoirs, that we expect emotion and lessons. And Ruth Kluger tells us right off the bat that that's not what she's going to give you. That's not what she's attempting to write. And so as a result, I think a lot of American readers find her very prickly. So I'll give you an example. She's very honest and tells us that just because someone was a victim of the Holocaust doesn't mean they were a good person. And she kind of does not shy away from giving us some of that grittiness and some of that victims behaving in horrible ways. She also talks about her mother and her relationship with her mother a lot. I think that's a central thread in her memoir. And she did not have an easy relationship with her mother in this period of her life. They had a difficult relationship, and then when they're together, they get sent to the camps together, and they still have a very conflict-ridden relationship, even when they're in a situation of life and death. And that is one of the points that she's trying to make. Like, this tragedy didn't make people better people. It didn't necessarily shift everybody's relationships with one another. And I think that's why it's not as widely read in the U.S., as opposed to in Europe, where this book was a bestseller and it was a lot more widely read. But I highly recommend it, especially if you're tired of reading World War II books and Holocaust memoirs, because sometimes can be overdone. This is one of those that is not, and I think people who don't normally read Holocaust memoirs or World War II books would really like this one. All right, next on my list is a book that had an important impact in me academically, and that is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Actually, in both, so this was an important book professionally and personally. I think part of what this book did for me is really like articulate the status of women in modern society. And this was written in the late 40s. It was actually not widely read in the late 40s. It wasn't until the 60s and the 70s that The Second Sex became more popular as second wave feminists started reading it and really finding that it really spoke. It really spoke to the problems that women faced in society. And it's not full of easy answers. It's not full of any answers. I still like assigning it today because I think she speaks so well to even the issues that we are dealing with today, in that, all right, women have gained citizenship. They are present in a lot of the upper levels of world politics and in the economy, but there's still things that hold women back today. And that a lot of that has to do with children and lack of total financial independence, right? And that it's very difficult to do both, to both have a successful, fulfilling career and be a mother that is present and that's 100% present for her children and for her family. And basically what Simone de Beauvoir tells us is that that's just not going to happen in this society. There would have to be major structural changes to our society in order to make that possible, and it's just not like you basically have to choose, right? And I feel like we're still having those conversations about, can we have it all? Can we do both? Because men haven't done both, right? Successful men tend to focus on their careers and not on fatherhood. But that has been socially acceptable for men to do and not as socially acceptable for women to do. But all right, before I go on and on about this, I have a lot more I can say about Simone de Beauvoir. But I will move on for now and talk about the next book on my list, which is Como Agua para Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. So I read this book in Spanish when I first read it. But the English title is Like Water for Chocolate. A lot of people, I think, have probably seen the movie as opposed to read the book. I did read the book first, and I read it in large part because the main character's nickname is my nickname, Tita. That's what my family calls me, and it's the story of the youngest girl in a Mexican family. In a place in Mexico where traditionally the youngest girl, the youngest woman would not marry and would stay and take care of the parents. Tita is the youngest, and she falls in love as a young woman, and she is forbidden from marrying the man she loves. So what does the man she loves do? He marries her sister so he can be close to her. Tragedy ensues because nothing other than tragedy can come out of that. But what I really loved out of this book, and again, it's not one of those books I've reread multiple times, so it's been a while since I've read it. But what really stuck with me about this book was the food, the role that food plays in Tita's life, the way her emotional life and its connection to food was just so beautiful, and I connected with her emotionally, and that was a really powerful connection at the time, and it's one that has stayed with me until now. So at some point I would like to reread this book, but I think that was such a powerful reading experience emotionally for me that it would probably be hard to replicate. All right, next up is the book that opened up mysteries for me, and that is Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. So this is one of her standalone books, and it is actually a really great place to start, and not just because I started with it, but And Then There Were None is one of those kind of closed house mysteries where a bunch of people are invited to this mansion, and they start showing up one by one, and it turns out the host doesn't show up, and then they start dying one by one, and you gotta figure out who did it. Christie is really a master of these kinds of stories. Like, after I read this, I read the ABC Murders, which I loved, and then I just started devouring mysteries like crazy. So I love reading these kinds of books. I love Agatha Christie, even though I am still working through her canon, but I think this is one of those books that opened up that world for me. Another book that was really probably the most impactful book on this list was Christie's Great Idea by Anne M. Martin. So The Babysitter's Club. I just picked the first one in the series. This series was these are the books that made me a reader. They just did. They came at exactly the right time in my life. My family had just moved to a new city, and my school had a book fair. I don't know how my parents agreed to it, but they started paying for the monthly subscription, so that each month I would get a new Babysitter's Club book, and I just devoured these books like crazy. And then when I wasn't getting enough of them, then I started branching out, reaching for other things. And so for that alone, I have so much love and gratitude for this series. Well, the next book on the list is also one that I read at a young age. This was actually assigned in school, and that is My Brother Sam is Dead by James Lincoln Collier and Christopher Collier. This is one of those books that really helped set the course of my career, because it was in 7th grade that I discovered my love for history, and I discovered that I was good at it. And I still remember parts of the paper that I wrote for this book. It's how important this book was in my educational life, and it's really kind of key in me discovering that passion for history. And I went on to get a PhD in history, so this was part of that puzzle. It was a piece in that puzzle, and I think what I really loved about this book was that it was not about the stories of great men in history. So it really showed me that history from below could be really powerful. It's the story of this family, this American family in, I forgot where exactly they're at, but in the colonies. The father is a loyalist, so he does not believe in the revolution. He believes that the Americans should stay part of the British Empire, and his oldest son, Sam, joins the rebel army. He believes in the American Revolution, and he joins the army. The story is told from the younger brother's point of view, though, and so it really plays with the family dynamics here of this young kid who really admires his older brother, wants to be like him, but his older brother is in direct opposition with his dad, who he loves and respects. So, this was still, like I said, it's just part of the puzzle. It wasn't a fully satisfying story to me, in that it focused a lot on the men. But then I started, this got me started thinking about, well, what about the lives of women? And I need to read about that. And it got me down that line. And it was, and for that, again, I will always be grateful to this book for that. Like I said, it's only one part of the puzzle, because I didn't end up doing American history. My degree is in world history and European history, and more specifically in French history. So the other part of the puzzle actually occurred around the same time, when in 1997 or 8, I don't remember exactly, when the World Cup was held in France, and I was sitting down to watch the World Cup games with my family, and they always do the like get to know the host country little bits. And I fell in love with France, and I knew at some point in my life I needed to go to France, and I have now. I've been to France multiple times. I did a study abroad, and I've gone for research, and it's played a major part in my life, is what I'm saying. And before I get all emotional and teary, I will move on to the last book on my list, which is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This has to be in there. I love the story. I love Jane Austen's writing. I love all the reimaginings of it. Like, I'm here for every reimagining. As much as I love Jane Austen, I'm not a purist. I will take any and all reimaginings of it, including the ones with zombies. My favorite reimagining of Pride and Prejudice is probably the movie Bride and Prejudice, which is a Bollywood-inspired one of it. I also have on my TBR E.B. Savoy's Pride, which promises to be a really good one. But I think what has made Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice in particular so popular, and what has helped it be so relevant even today, is how sharp Jane Austen was at identifying and discussing the lives of women, of these kind of lower upper class of women, and does it in such a great, funny, beautiful, sometimes tragic way. And I think that's why it's still a major pop culture element even today, Pride and Prejudice. So, by the way, so I told you I will read any and all Pride and Prejudice reimaginings. Does anybody know if there's been a Mexican version of it? Because I would love to read that, and I haven't seen any kind of reimagining of it set in Mexico, but I would really love it if there is something out there like that. So that is it. Those are my top 10 books of all time. Like I said, this is a list that's kind of open to change at any point. I've read some really great books in the last couple of years, and I'm just kind of giving them time to really become favorites. So this list, I'm expecting it to change for more books to be added, so it doesn't have to stay at 10 for me. So I'm hoping that in a year I can revisit it and see how it has changed. And because I think kind of at least for me, my favorite books do tend to be impacted by where I'm at, both intellectually and emotionally, and the relationship I have to the reading experience of them. So hopefully at some point I'm going to reread some of these, and then my list might change a little bit. Also, if any of these are on your list of top favorite books of all time, let me know down below, because I have a feeling that a lot of us share some of these books in common. You can also let me know if some of these are in your most hated books of all time as well. Maybe that'll be the next video. No. I think what I want to do is make this a series and do top books series, and the next one might be World War II books. So let me know if you're interested in that one, or if you have ideas for what kind of top book list you would like to see from me. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.